Thank you, Congressman Hurd, for joining us today on Eye on Iowa. We have a lot to get into to continue our conversation from last time. But first, before we get started, I have to ask, out of pure curiosity, are you going to be putting your name in the ring for the presidential election in 2024?
Well, Sarah, it's great to be with you again, and thanks for the question. First and foremost, I'm sick and tired of the GOP losing. All right, we lost the House in 2018. We lost the Senate and the White House in 2020. We didn't take the House back with the red wave that we should have in 2022. And I've been lucky and fortunate to serve my country in different ways, and I'm not going to rule out the opportunity to serve my country again.
And with that said, let's roll into some of our conversation about cybersecurity. One thing that you and I discussed back a couple weeks ago is the fact that data can be, cultivated by all of these social media outlets. Now let's take a step away from TikTok and look at things more like Twitter and Facebook. One of the things you said is that you really want to be able to control your own data. Now I'm going to play devil's advocate really quick and say, some people would say these platforms are free to use. They are using data and maybe sending it to third parties, and that's kind of your payment. What do you have to say to that?
Well, look, the attention economy has been around for a long time, right? That's the foundation of most media. The reason you were able to get broadcast television over the airwaves is because advertisers were paying for it, and advertisers had the chance to get access to your eyeballs, right? So this concept is not new, but the difference is in the ability to take advantage and potentially manipulate that. The fact that a lot of things are training. So not only is it I'm paying you because of my attention or because you're serving me ads, but I'm helping you train and develop audiences, there should be some benefit to that. Or if there's not, I should be able to say, hey, I don't want to participate in this thing. And so I think individuals should have more control over their information. Now, what I'm talking about is fairly significant change from where we are now. But you led the question talking about cybersecurity. One of the things we also need to make sure is that people are protecting our information the right way. Why are we seeing ransomware increase? We're seeing that increase because people that have access to our data are not protecting it appropriately. And so I think we can achieve a system in which you're able to have these tools and these devices and these games and the software, but also make sure that I have a little bit more control and that individuals have a little bit more control of their data.
And on that note, we have seen our lawmakers take, a very strong stance against things like Facebook, ByteDance, TikTok, whatever you may say, but they're asking a lot of questions that maybe the younger generation say isn't the right questions. What questions need to be asked of these companies?
Look, it's a great question. I think the most famous one was when the CEO of Facebook first testified, and people were like, "How do you make money?" And you're just like, "Come on." Unfortunately, there are still many of our lawmakers that don't even use email. Right, like email is not a new technology. And so, what are the questions that we should be asking? The question that we should be asking is, how are you taking and using an individual's information? How are you making sure people have a broad access to these tools? How are you ensuring that these tools are not being taken advantage of? And how are you protecting individuals from using this? One of the things, if we know what we know now from social media, nobody would have thought that things like Instagram would have led to teenage girls doing things like cutting themselves, right? Like that is outrageous, and nobody should want that. And how are we addressing those issues? Also, again, I help build a cybersecurity company, and for me, making sure my data is protected, especially when we have an adversary like the Chinese Communist Party, who is trying, and we're seeing an increase in sophisticated attacks from them. Last year, I think we saw nearly 60 zero-day attacks A 0 day is where nobody knew that this vulnerability existed in software. And a lot of that came from the Chinese government. And the reason we're seeing it come from the Chinese government is you're seeing a willingness for them to attack, and we're seeing an increase in their capabilities. So one of the questions, how are we defending against those types of adversaries, is something that we should be asking. What are the kids asking you when people say, "Hey, this is not what we should be asking"? What are you hearing that folks want to know? What the questions that we should be asking these systems?
I think it's interesting because I think when we've seen these hearings, a lot of young people are hearing questions that are so baseline. How do you make a post? It's like what you're saying, how are you making money? And younger generations already understand this because we're using the platforms, I myself being one of them. And so I think it's interesting because I think to myself, how can we dig deeper into an issue or regulate an issue when we don't even know the top line of it?
For sure. 100, you're 100% right. When I was in Congress, the question I were asking was, how do I use these tools to better communicate with my constituents, right? Because, not everybody is getting their information via the mail, right? Or which is still a significant expense when it comes to campaigns or when it comes to educating your constituency, right? And so we got to be able to do all of it. Like my father is 91 years old and he doesn't use any of these things. And so you still got to be able to communicate with someone like that, but then also make sure that you're using whatever the latest tool is to communicate with folks that are using the latest and greatest.
And now spinning off of that and looking at the 2024 election, we saw back in 2016, 2020, there was a lot of questions about how social media platforms were using campaign tactics, or, we've all heard the conversation around fake news, false information about the election, about voting. And so what do you see us doing to combat that going into 2024?
Well, first and foremost, I think the last two elections were the most, secure elections we've seen in our country. And one of the things that I do know is happening when you look at our adversaries, primarily overseas, the Chinese government, the Russian government, the Iranian government, that are pushing disinformation, handling and dealing with that kind of activity is very different than somebody pushing or promoting some conspiracy or something here locally, right? And in the United States. So when it comes to understanding and focusing on an adversary, our intelligence services, federal law enforcement is focused on that. And we know the tactics, techniques, and procedures that our adversaries are using. And so we're able to monitor and focus. But ultimately, I think the platforms have focused on this issue of political speech and making sure that it's clear that something is political speech. Look, for someone like me to run a Google ad, it's not easy, right? Because you have to verify your identity, why you're using it. They limit certain activities from being promoted. So I think the platforms, when it comes to paid ads, have really cracked down. But it doesn't, it's hard, and there's an ability for people to speak their mind when they're on social media, and whether something like that goes viral, it means we got to educate people. So if someone's lying about when an election is, how you vote, which we saw some of that, we need the various voting agencies across the country. There's about 10,000 of them, to make sure that they're prepared to counter wrong information like that. And what we have seen secretaries of states across the country being focused on people that are perpetuating lies about when and where you can vote. And I think there's been we've had two elections where we've seen people being able to counter that.
Now, talking about 2024, I do want to shift and talk about the Ukraine-Russia war. How do you think that's going to impact voters? What questions do you think they need to be asking of these candidates going into 2024?
Look, I think the first question is why should we be helping the Ukrainians? Right? This is a debate. Unfortunately, it's a debate within the Republican Party, and to me, it's very clear. The United States of America has built an international order that benefits us. After World War II, instead of taking spoils from helping to win the war, we gave Europe and the rest of the world a helping hand to rebuild. And we built partners that allowed us to grow our economy. We are the most successful economy to ever exist on this planet, partially because we built this international order that benefits us, right? So when it comes to threats to the international order, the Russians, Vladimir Putin specifically invading Ukraine, we should be standing up for the Ukrainians, because guess what? If we don't do that, then the rest of Eastern Europe is not going to believe and trust the United States. It's easier to go along with Russia. Then we're going to see Western Europe be like, we can't trust the United States, so we're going to go with the Chinese government. A couple of weeks ago, the French president Macron was in China and spoke to a U.S. newspaper and said the United States shouldn't force France to choose between the United States and China, implying that the United States, we are not going to like their answer. And so the Chinese government is trying to build an international coalition to surpass us as the global superpower. And what is going to happen if the United States becomes the United Kingdom of the 21st century? What do I mean by that? The UK was the most important country in the world. They controlled half of the planet, and they had more than 50% of global GDP. Now the United Kingdom only has 3% of global GDP. And so this could potentially happen to us, and our unique role in the world benefits every single American. And so this is why foreign policy is not foreign, and that we have to defend this international order that has led us to build trading partners, that has led us to be the nation that we are. Oh, and by the way, we got to defend the Ukrainians and protect our border and deal with inflation and grapple with technology policy to make sure take advantage of technology before it takes advantage of us. We got to do all those things. And because we live in a complicated world, and we need more common sense in order to deal with that complicated world. So when it comes to Ukraine, that's the question. The next question on Ukraine is, what did we learn from this Ukrainian war that we should be applying to other places in the world, like Taiwan? And right now, most people don't realize the importance of Taiwan. The Chinese government has made it very clear that Taiwan becoming part of China, mainland China again, I should say the People's Republic of China, is a priority and something that they're willing to take by force. And how is that going to impact the United States? If we didn't think inflation's bad, if we have the Chinese government control 70% of advanced manufacturing, right? That's everything from advanced manufacturing of semiconductors. Let me be clear there. So why does semiconductors matter? So everything from our smartphones to your car to your refrigerator it has a semiconductor, and semiconductor is the building blocks of every piece of technology. So if we think inflation is bad now, if the Chinese government invades Taiwan, they get that at 60%. China already has 10%, so they're going to control 70% of advanced manufacturing. How are they going to be able to use that against us, right? In a number of ways. So how have we learned from the Ukraine and prevent this from happening in Taiwan? It's real simple. Help the Taiwanese now. If we would have given support and helped the Ukrainians back in 2008, 2009, 2015, the Ukrainians would be in better position to have repelled the Russian advancement, right? Let's not make those same mistakes that we did in Taiwan.
You hit a lot of great topics in that, and I want to break some of that down. One of the things that I think is interesting going into 2024 with Trump running is that when he was in office, he kind of had a unique relationship with Vladimir Putin. Now, how do you think voters are going to look at that now, knowing that, Russia has invaded Ukraine and we're fighting against that?
Vladimir Putin is a thug and is only focused on one thing, and that's him staying in power and continuing to steal from the Russian people. Period. Full stop. Relations with Russia and Vladimir Putin specifically cannot be reset as long as Vladimir Putin is in power. Period. Full stop. And Vladimir Putin is doing everything within his power to destabilize the United States. He wants to see and erode trust in our democratic institutions. He wants there to be conflict within our political parties. He wants there to be conflict across our political parties. He wants there to be conflict between Washington, D.C. and the capitals, because the only way he knows what is getting in Vladimir Putin's way of reestablishing the territorial integrity of the USSR, it's a little thing called NATO, right? And what's important to NATO? A place called America, right? And so if you erode that trust that Americans have in institutions like NATO, if you get Americans to say, hey, this isn't important to our way of life, then Vladimir Putin wins, right? And so this is something that's very clear. I've been connected to American national security since I've been out of college for over 20 years, over 2 decades, right? And I've learned something real simple. Your friends should love you and your enemies should fear you. All right? It's a simple principle. However, that requires you to understand who are your friends and who are your enemies. And Vladimir Putin is an enemy, full stop.
Now, you also mentioned semiconductors, and I think that's so interesting because that is an issue that is being brought up among candidates this election. And you kind of explained, these are in your phones, they're in your computers, they're in your refrigerators, and maybe not all Americans understand that we get a majority of them from China. And so some candidates are talking about incentivizing making them locally or making them in the United States. How do you think we should go about that?
Look, this was a process when it comes to actual semiconductors, and how the fact that these little things got, the smaller they get, the more powerful they get, and the fact that a phone is more powerful today than a big old mainframe computer, like when I was, learning computer science, at Texas A&M University, right? And a lot of this technology was started and incubated in our national labs. Right? Like innovation and creativity, America's number one by far. And what we failed to do was we allowed that technology to be exported, and we allowed, it's not just semiconductors being manufactured in places like Taiwan and China. There's one company that builds the machines that can make semiconductors. So, and that's a company called AMSL. And a lot of the technology they're using was stuff that was created right here in our own national labs. So how do we ensure that we do not get impacted by an adversary cornering the market? We learned a little bit about this, about energy, when the beginning of the Ukrainian war, and the Europeans felt that because they relied on Russia so much for their energy needs, and the Russians were able to use that to try to influence their behavior. So how do we have our allies and friends and bring more of that manufacturing back here in the United States? There was a bill in Congress called the CHIPS Act. One of the things for that was investment in the United States for some of these companies to build that here. We're seeing an increase in manufacturing in places like Arizona, Texas, and New York State. And so we got to be able to start building these things here. But it also requires us to think differently of how we build these things, right? A plant to make semiconductors is like $20 billion with a B. Okay, that's super expensive. Now, can we be doing things a little bit differently to build a plant for $5 billion, for $1 billion, right? And can we do this faster? So that requires us to think differently of how we've been producing and semiconductors. And there's a number of entities and companies out there that's trying to do that. So how do we also incentivize that and make sure that our national labs are doing what we do great, and provide and help some of those entities in the private sector do this? And so ultimately it comes down to, how do we ensure the public and private sector are working together on these major national security issues when it comes to technology, and how do we improve manufacturing of advanced semiconductors is one of those things.
Leapfrogging off of that, there's also been a conversation around electric vehicles, electric vehicle batteries, and trying to make that more of a US made thing. What are your thoughts?
So it starts with the rare earth minerals that are involved in making those batteries, right? And again, a little place that rhymes with China, has cornered a market on many of those rare earth minerals. So how are we able to develop and mine rare earth minerals in a way that is environmentally friendly, but also leads us to the tools and the resources we need in order to see electric vehicles propagate? And so yeah, look, this notion that one of the things I think is fascinating when it comes to everyone talking about electric vehicles and the environment in general, we need more electricity. We need more power. Like the needs of us for energy consumption is only going to increase, and we got to figure out different ways on how to meet that in a way that produces a net zero environment in across the rest of the world. And electric vehicles is one of those things. So yeah, we should be the leaders on this. And ultimately, now that you have the large manufacturers of US vehicles focusing on this issue, I think we're going to see this evolve. But it starts with understanding the supply chain, and that's everything from the rare earth minerals to all the elements that are used to produce batteries. Oh, and by the way, we also need to be improving battery technology so that charge lasts, twice as long as what they're doing now.
I'm so glad you brought up the environment, because that is another issue that Iowans are asking a lot of questions about. Would you support geoengineering?
Well, geoengineering is a broad term, and I think the specifics of what you're talking about matter. But here's what we do know, right? We do know that we need to be producing less CO2, and we need to get some of the CO2 that's existing there, get that out of the atmosphere. And we need to increase production of electricity and power because of the increasing needs. There's about 750 million people around the world who do not have access to electricity. And then if you add clean cooking, right, people that don't have access to clean cooking, it's about 2.4 billion people. Right? That's a huge percent of the population. So we need to be increasing access to these tools. So we need to be following an all the above energy strategy. That we need nuclear power is one of the reasons we need. That's something that is going to allow us to meet our energy demand in a way that doesn't produce CO2, and that's everything from fission and fusion. Fusion technology is new and it's cutting edge. And there's a lot of folks that are working on developing that. And I think ultimately, this is going to be about creativity and technology that helps us ensure that, Mother Nature and planet Earth doesn't planet Earth is undefeated, right? We need her more than she needs us. And we need to make sure that we're leaving this planet off better for our kids than what we received.
Now I'm going to take a pivot really quick and talk about where you used to represent a large portion of the southern border along Texas. Now, there's been a lot of conversation about what we need to do to secure the border, what we need to do about immigration. However, you have a very unique perspective given how close you are to the issue. What do you think the GOP specifically needs to do next to get a candidate in office and their stance on immigration / the border?
Look, I represented the largest congressional district that had the border than any other member of Congress. 820 miles. It took 10 and a half hours to drive across my district at 80 miles an hour, which was the speed limit in most of the district. This was an issue that I spent a lot of time dealing with and worked on one of the only bipartisan immigration deals in Congress in recent history. We know what the solutions are, and it's very simple. It starts with stop treating everybody that's coming in this country as an asylum seeker. Asylum is a very specific thing. You have to be part of a protected class. That the identified protected classes are listed. It's usually something around gender, sexual orientation, religion, and you have to be persecuted by your government because you're part of that protected class, or you are Your government is not protecting you from being persecuted because you're part of that protected class. And so the definition is very narrow. Seeking to try to get a better job is not a reason to seeking asylum. However, the last two administrations have treated everybody as an asylum seeker, which led to last year having 2.5 million people come into the country illegally. Now, most of those people all use a human smuggler. It's $25 billion because on average, a human smuggler gets about $10,000 per person. So why are we not dismantling these human smuggling networks that are taking advantage of people and taking their hard-earned money, taking their life savings, and taking them on a perilous trip? We should be dismantling those human smuggling networks. It's not humane to allow that to continue to happen. So that's how we got to address those two issues. We should also be streamlining legal immigration. You know, if a kid comes to the United States and gets a degree from one of our great universities, they should be able to get a good paying job here in the United States. You know, every industry, even with the economy the way it is now, there's a lot of industries that still need workers. Why can't we, you know, if Iowa needs agriculture workers and Texas needs workers in the food services industry, right? Why can't we figure that out? It's 2023. We have the tools to be able to figure that out. So let's streamline legal immigration. Oh, and you get more people coming in here legally. They're paying taxes. They're helping to address inflation. They're helping to pay down the debt, all of those issues. So in addition to treating, you know, how you secure the border by not using everybody treating everybody as an asylum seeker, dismantling human smuggling networks, streamlining legal immigration, we got to address root causes in many of these countries. Historically, most of the illegal immigration that was coming in the U.S. came from the Northern Triangle, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. We should be using some of our the foreign aid dollars in a programmatic way, in a regional way, to address the root causes, which is violence, lack of economic opportunity, and extreme poverty, which is forcing people in those countries, pushing people in those countries to try to come to the United States illegally. It's a fraction of the cost to solve the problem there before it gets to our shores. So those are some of the elements. Oh, and by the way, guess what, Sarah? 70% of Republican primary voters, what I just explained, agree with that. And so do 70% of Democratic voters. Unfortunately, this is one of those issues that politicians would rather use as a political bludgeon against each other rather than solving the problem. Sorry for my a long answer to that, but this is something that I spent a lot of time on.
No, and I'm glad you do, because to wrap it up, back to Iowa, I was on a local TV station before this, and during the pandemic, one of the key groups of people who were really vulnerable to COVID-19 were some of our immigrant workers who are working in our food distribution, groups, working on our farms, just really local people who were being impacted by COVID-19. And so sometimes I think when we get so far up here into the Midwest, we think, well, what is our concerns about immigration and border security? And really it comes down to our neighbors and our coworkers who, were heavily impacted about not getting access to the vaccine or, having safe working conditions. I remember specifically Tyson Foods got kind of in trouble here in Iowa, or had some eyebrows raised here in Iowa about how they were still kind of running their plants and not necessarily creating social distancing measures for their employees, which were predominantly immigrants. And so can you kind of wrap us up in explaining how this matters to Middle America?
The United States of America has benefited from the brain gain of every other country. We are a stronger nation because many of the best and the brightest and the people that are willing to work the hardest want to come to the United States because they believe in the American dream. And this is what has fueled a lot of our growth. It has fueled our economy. And this is an important part of what makes America tick and what makes us special and what allows all Americans to enjoy a quality of life that we have gotten to enjoy, which is also the envy of the rest of the world. And so we should be treated, once people are here, we should be treating everybody with respect and with dignity. And it's within our capabilities to solve this problem. And anybody who thinks that we can't solve this problem and that's in elected office probably should go look for another job.
Now, to wrap us up, because we are at the end of our time, I am going to bring us back to our first question really quick. You know, Mike Pence has made some comments about people needing to announce their run for candidacy before June. Do you think we'll have any announcements from you before June?
Well, I think Vice President Pence is accurate with some of those numbers and the necessary steps to put the right tactics, techniques, and procedures in to do that. I think that timeline makes sense. And as I said at the start of the hour, look, I've been lucky to have served overseas as an undercover officer in the CIA, where I was stopping terrorists from trying to blow up our homeland, Russian spies from stealing our secrets, and trying to stop nuclear weapons proliferators from bringing in dirty bombs. Being able to serve my hometown in Congress and working on every issue from border security, the technology policy, I've been fortunate to have that. And I'm not ruling out the opportunity to serve my country again in the future.
Thank you so much for your time, Congressman, and thank you for joining us on Eye on Iowa.